Well, I'm Andy Van Horn, as Richard said, summer science program of 1962 when Sputnik was still a concern. Obviously, energy is instrumental for the survival of all of us, and how we generate energy and how we use it has been a concern at various times. Back in the early 1970s, I was living in England, and OPEC decided to have an oil embargo, and that helped me determine that energy was important because I organized the summer school at Oxford. And subsequently, I went to Harvard, where I looked at risks, costs, and benefits of integrated energy systems. That is not just a coal-fired power plant, but where did the coal come from? How did it get there? What are the transportation systems? What are the emissions? What are the health effects? In other words, the life cycle costs and impacts. And that's too often ignored, but it's absolutely critical as we once again today are worried about global energy. And I got here, I became a consultant after I left Harvard as a postdoc, and I've been involved with the US EPA in setting environmental regulations, new source performance standards, with the Electric Power Research Institute in leading their efforts to institute cap and trade for sulfur dioxide, which was the pollutant that initiated cap and trade markets in order to reduce acid rain. And from that, we've moved on to concern about carbon in the 90s and analyzed ways that the industry, the electric utility industry, could actually develop glide path mechanisms for reducing carbon between 2000 and say 2030 or 2035. Well, that didn't quite happen for a variety of reasons that probably some of you are familiar with. But finally, we have now an infrastructure act that promises to lead to the development and deployment of green energy. And how energy is defined as green is clearly critical. And I'm here today. I've been a consultant for over 40 years on primarily on green energy, but also coal-fired power plants and how to make them operate cleaner and reduce their emissions. So it's a whole system. We have in the US, we have three major electricity grids: the Western Interconnect, the Eastern Interconnect, and those folks down in Texas called ERCOT. But all of them are now concerned about how do we stay reliable, how do we provide affordable energy, and how do we devise and make an efficient energy system. And so those are all criteria that we have to keep in mind when we evaluate any particular energy source. And we're not starting from ground zero, otherwise, not to make a pun with geothermal, but geothermal is everywhere. And the center of the Earth is 6,000 degrees, which is approximately the temperature of the center of the sun. If we can tap that energy, we can provide millions of years of all of civilization's energy needs, but it's not manifest everywhere in the world. You all know about the Ring of Fire and volcanic activities, and the world's most extensive and was the largest geothermal power plant is in north of San Francisco at the geysers. But countries like Indonesia and the Philippines and Iceland rely primarily on, or rely to a large extent, Iceland primarily, but others on geothermal power. And we've had geothermal power actually operating in Larderello, Italy since 1930. In California, we've had it since 1960 at the geysers. And now my company is helping develop closed loop geothermal, which is different from conventional because it circulates a working fluid, which could be water or supercritical carbon dioxide or isopentane or a mixture, in a sealed pipe that goes down and extracts only the heat. It doesn't bring up the brine, and it doesn't have the effluents, but we're in the process of making it work and developing it around the world. But so I can tell you about geothermal, the different technologies that depend on primarily on the temperature of the brine that comes up, either that you produce or you go down, drill wells to find it and produce it. And the technology on the surface depends on how hot it is when you get it to the surface. But geothermal is everywhere, and it can be used not only for power generation, but also district heating. The city of Boise, Idaho, has had district heating for geothermal in buildings for over 100 years. The Cornell campus is now heated by geothermal, and they're going deeper to provide power to make the campus as much independent as they can. Anyway, that's probably enough of a brief introduction. I'd be happy to answer specific questions or general questions as the conversation goes forward. And so I'll leave it to Richard to solicit some of those questions.
Well, thanks very much, Andy. Let's start with, if you don't mind, just giving us an overview of the kind of the pros and cons of the different sources of energy. We're pretty much familiar enough with fossil fuels. I think everyone understands those pretty well. But what about solar? What about wind? What about nuclear, in terms of just the bullet point, big pros and big cons of each one, and then geothermal as a compare and contrast?
Well, like I say, I like to look at each technology with a lens that includes what are the criteria that are important for evaluating that technology. And, primarily public utility commissions and others have been focused on affordability. And so oftentimes over the last 50 years, that's been the primary goal. And we've had plenty of fossil energy. We've made a transition as fracking helped develop and bring out shale gas. Actually, we saved billions of dollars by bringing gas forward, natural gas, and reducing its price significantly, and saving our economy and the world economy literally billions of dollars with cheaper gas. The energy systems, as you know, expanded greatly during our lifetimes, from burning oil in power plants to coal, which of course has health effects that cause tens of thousands of premature deaths every year. So let me come on to what are the alternatives. And natural gas is certainly a bridge fuel that we're not going to get rid of. And in California, we rely on it for ramping up in the afternoon ramps, which have gotten over 15,000 megawatts between, say, 3 and 6 o'clock. And what do you do for that? Well, you burn natural gas. And why do you need to burn it? Well, because we and other places have moved from a daily peak in the mid-afternoon where the air conditioning is needed and creates an annual and actually a daily peak for energy. You have to supply that somehow. And in California, we've been fortunate to build out solar and wind resources. I was with a group in my company that built one of the first wind farms in the early 1980s in the Altamont Pass. It was a 75 kilowatt turbine. And it was pumping water for the Bethany Reservoir, the Department of Water Resources. And it worked for maybe 3 years. And then the cells and gearboxes failed. Well, and people complained, well, we're paying 10 cents a kilowatt hour when we should be paying a marginal cost price of 2 or 3 cents. But the wind industry since then has developed globally. And we are now not building 75 kilowatt wind systems. We're building, well, standard now, maybe 2 to 2.5 megawatts. But I just saw an announcement that Vestas and some others are going to be building 15 megawatt wind farms that are, 300 meters tall. So, or almost 300 meters, 200 to 300. So wind has really matured. It's been developing through research and development and implementation since the early 1980s, and it's now global. And for example, the British have relied on it in the North Sea for offshore wind. And California is talking about offshore wind. But we all know what the main problem with wind is, and it's a similar problem with solar, but it's intermittent, and it doesn't often does not blow when you wish it to. And on August 10th of, I think, 2020, the wind was blowing pretty hard, and we had a gigawatt of wind power in California. And then between 3 and 4 p.m., that gigawatt of wind disappeared. Well, when it was blowing so hard, they let the natural gas power plants stay idle, or actually they started exporting power to other states and out of the area. So when the wind suddenly died down, they had to basically find resources, and they had to go to rolling blackouts that were very slow and actually not too widespread. That's happened, nearly happened again. But then the following February, you all heard what happened in Texas. Well, it wasn't wind. Wind actually worked really well. It was the gas system that froze, because despite in 2011, Texas had a freeze and all the power plants were told to harden themselves. I mean, wind turbines don't freeze in Wyoming because they know how to make them work at low temperatures. But in Texas, what they did was, oh, well, we're going to save the gas for the residential consumers. And and so we won't let the industrial consumers have it. But some of those industrial consumers were the pumps that pumped the gas through the pipelines. So the gas pipelines couldn't get gas to the power plants. It was kind of a major screw up, and we don't want to repeat that. We now have a problem internationally with gas, as you well know, the Russians and the Europeans, and they're massively trying to go to import liquefied natural gas and build the terminals. And they are successfully doing that because we developed fracking technologies to produce more natural gas and to be able to export it. And so we are now doing that, indicating that it's global. Anyway, I think out of this, wind is an important resource. We can talk about offshore wind and its disadvantages because, for example, in PJM, that's New Jersey, they've been talking about building offshore wind, and turns out the interconnection costs were initially estimated at $500 a kilowatt. I think now they might come down to more like 100. But when you start thinking about the transmission needs, and I also think, in California, we're concerned about things like humpback whales. What does that noise do offshore for offshore wind to marine animals and et cetera? In California, there's only a couple places you can bring it ashore. So wind
might be an issue if you're a bird as well.
Yeah, we haven't figured out how to tell raptors to stay away. I actually proposed not to a wind farm, but to a solar farm, a central tower solar farm, that they should circle drones around the perimeter of that. But what I have subsequently learned, raptors' eyes are on the sides of their heads, and they have brilliant eyes because they have to spot prey and they have to be able to dive down and catch it, etc. But they don't have such great vision straight ahead. And that's why they're unable to avoid wind turbines that to us would be, something to avoid.
Is there an issue for getting the rare earth minerals and so forth that are needed to create wind turbines to make them?
Well, that comes back to what I was talking about as life cycle costs. And in other words, where do you get the raw materials to build the facilities and the turbines? And then what do you do to dispose of them? So supply chains is now the buzzword for many different industries, as we all know. The minerals, the lithium, et cetera, supply chain is very important. But I think, yes, there are supply chain issues with wind. They figured out that some of the ways of, the turbine blades actually, balsa wood is one of the best substances. And so, there might be difficulties in getting enough of that. I think
how long does a wind turbine typically last before it fails on average?
Well, I don't absolutely know, because I assume the better ones, the newer ones are better. I mean, they do, the nacelles wear out. And one of the things that has happened is that they've upgraded, what were, a couple hundred kilowatt turbines. Well, they've upgraded them to 200, to 2 megawatts. So those turbine blades have to be disposed of because, they're literally, 100 or 50 meters long, etc. So I don't know what the lifetime is, but they do
Is
fail.
it
within
3 years, 5 years, 10 years?
I would hope 10 years. I don't know basically
Okay.
what they are, and that depends on.
Anyway, they do
where
wear
they are.
out, and they got to be replaced on some kind of schedule. So
Well, and then shipping them to their burial site is something that hasn't been perfected yet. There's lots of buried wind turbines that that have to be disposed of, and so that is a problem. It's not a problem with geothermal because the power plants are standard power plant equipment and things like that. And
yeah, we'll get back to that. What about solar though? You got to make the panels. You got to put them somewhere where they have exposure to the sun. That takes a lot of area, and they're intermittent too.
Yeah, that's the big problem. I mean, solar is wonderful, and it's wonderful when the sun shines. But as we have seen in California, it doesn't shine all the time, and every day it disappears. And so you have to make up for that power between 4 and 9 p.m. We've changed the rates and the designs. And in places like New England, solar power really isn't viable. I mean, it might be nice temporarily, but no, it's not worth it. And it doesn't shine enough with enough insulation to make it worthwhile. And
Canada, New Zealand, etc.
yeah,
The higher lower latitudes.
So solar is great, but it has those problems. You have to keep the solar cells clean, and they have invented ways to wash them off. But if they're out in the desert and the sand blows, there's not really a lot you can do to protect them. So and
yeah, they get dirty. They get a coating of dirt on them. I used to live in West Texas, and everything gets covered with dirt, sand.
And the solar, I mean, the lifetimes of solar cells, they've improved dramatically. But one key point to remember is they have improved dramatically. And one of the key things about all the green technologies is what are the learning curves? And again, solar has been talked about for decades, but only in the last, 12 years really, or 15 years, have the costs really come down exponentially as they made extreme advances in the efficiencies of solar cells. And the utility solar cells are much more efficient in general for producing electricity than the ones that you would put on your house, which of course then give rise to issues like distributed energy. If you can produce energy at the site where you're using it, such as your residence, then that offers certain advantages. But unless you have storage associated with it, which now the California Public Utilities Commission recommends, you aren't necessarily providing any backup to the utility, and you're creating new ways of designing distribution systems. So
of course, the storage is associated with other supply chain issues and disposal cost issues and life cycle costs and so forth. There's I want you to describe the closed loop geothermal next, but I want to point out first that as far as I can tell, there's one big advantage that both solar and wind seem to have over geothermal, and that is better lobbyists. They seem to have much better lobbyists because they get so much more subsidies from so many governments than geothermal. But we'll get back to the politics maybe later, but we'll go ahead and describe what closed loop geothermal has. How is it?
Yes.
How is it? What is it? How does it work?
Let me first describe conventional geothermal, which has typically been operating, like I said, in some places for over 100 years. And it depends on whether you're talking about residential heating or commercial heating. Those are basically closed loop systems, but they go down either anywhere from 15 feet for a residential building to 50 meters if you want to hit a district heating. And that is closed loop because they're pumping a fluid, water or something, generally water, and using it to heat like a radiator. The systems I've been working on and that I've been concerned with are power generation. And the way that works is obviously you have to have temperatures, minimum temperatures of like 110 degrees centigrade And those go into an organic rake and cycle. What they are is they're power plants that drill a well down, and oftentimes the manifestation is on the surface of the resource. But then they pump the brine, the hot brine, up to the surface, where they put it through a heat exchanger to another gas or liquid that vaporizes, and that vapor drives the turbine. So, and then they pump the excess, the water, the brine, back down into the ground. So it's disposed of.
You're describing conventional geothermal, not closed loop.
That's conventional geothermal. It involves two wells, and they pump the brine up out of the ground. In some cases, it's hot, like 180 degrees, and it can be flashed through a turbine to generate power, or it can be superheated, like in the geysers. And so it's like 200 degrees centigrade. And so it's essentially dry steam, and they can then drive a turbine, and they re-inject it down in the ground. The problem with that is that some of that water coming out, or brine, there's a lot of things that have to be disposed of from it, including right now lithium, which they're going to be extracting. But you have to re-inject it, and not all of it replenishes. So those wells will deplete over a period of 20 to 40 years. And that's true at the geysers. It's been depleting. Its original capacity was 1,500 megawatts. When I first got involved, it was down to 1,100. Now it's down to about 925.
So they deplete, the pressure goes down just in the reservoir, just like an oil and gas reservoir.
Yeah.
And it's going to inevitably come to the point where it has to be abandoned because there's no more flow.
Yeah, and that so far, you don't try not to drill. And part of the problem with conventional geothermal is that you can drill a well, and then half a mile away you drill into the same, what you think is the same reservoir, and it's dry. And so that's why in the 80s and 90s, there wasn't a great expansion in geothermal, because it's more expensive. Well, closed loop geothermal solves some of those problems. It's still expensive because we're perfecting the technology and trying to follow the learning curve. What it does, it says, okay, for one concept is, well, you drill the well down into the reservoir that is there, the heat is there, but you put a pipe down it that's sealed, and you then can drill a horizontal well for maybe a kilometer or two, and then you bring it up. And as it's gone down the well, you put a working fluid. It could be water, it could be, as I mentioned, isopentane, it could be supercritical carbon dioxide. That fluid falls down the well, it heats up at the bottom, and then it's essentially a thermosiphon. And then when it gets to the well at the other end, it comes up, and you use it either through a heat exchanger, or basically a heat exchanger to drive a turbine on the surface. So it's closed loop. It doesn't have effluents that have to be disposed of. It just extracts the heat. But the thermodynamics are the issue. Can you do that and make power effectively and efficiently? And what we have done, there are two main ways to do this. There's a company in Canada that's gotten good government funding there, and they're now active in Europe as well as elsewhere. And their idea is to take the closed loop, and at the bottom of it, what you do is you extend out like a pitchfork, and each one of those is like a radiator, and inside the pipe is a return, so that the fluid radiates out to the ends of the pitchfork and then comes back through another pipe that essentially brings it up to the surface near where the original pipe was. And as a radiator, it heats up and then will generate power. Now, our concept at GreenFire Energy, which we were founded in 2014, and we are actually the first to do closed loop, is to use a coaxial pipe in pipe. And so what you do is you put a working fluid down the pipe, but inside that pipe is a coaxial pipe. So at the bottom, the pipe terminates, but it's at the heat where the reservoir is the hottest. The pipe, the working fluid falls down the pipe, and then as it heats up at the bottom, it expands and rises up either the outside, or it can be done in the reverse way, depending which is more efficient. And it rises up and it could go through a heat exchanger and drive a turbine. And that is very much more, in a sense, it's very efficient in terms of using working fluid and not wasting heat. The question is, can you get enough heat up to make it efficient and workable? And you have to have enough diameter in the pipe. Typically, geothermal wells are 11 to 13 inches or somewhat bigger when you consider the steel and the cement. Whereas oil and gas wells are 5 to 7 inches or maybe a little larger than that, because they're only pumping fluid up. But closed loop has the promise of not only generating power from greenfield wells that I'm talking about, but also in certain oil and gas fields that are hot enough at the bottom, we can retrofit an oil and gas well to generate geothermal power. And if they're paying 35 cents a kilowatt hour or 50 cents now to drive a diesel pump, they'd much rather have it generated by geothermal, which is essentially free. And the operating cost of geothermal.
May I interject a question?
Sure.
There?
Go ahead.
You're mentioning the concentric tubes in your design. And sulfur wells work that way, but there's a significant heat transfer problem because of the ratio of the length of the coaxial tube arrangement and the thermal contact area of the wall.
Yes.
And so that was kind of the gist of the question. One other thing, I don't know if this fits the direction you're going. Can we base this on a reference or benchmark plant design, say 1 gigawatt or 100 megawatts or 10 megawatts or something, just for?
Well, these are the benchmarks that we did a test at the COSO geothermal power plant, which is on the Eastern Sierra. And basically our wells will be generating from 1 to 5 megawatts of power. And so they're not high powered. That adds some flexibility if you want to turn them off, but that's the size. And ultimately, if you can go deep enough, and there are companies now like Quaise Energy that want to use millimeter waves to drill down, 8 to 10 kilometers or 5 to 10 kilometers when the temperature is high enough. And if you can do that, then you've got enough heat that you think you can get it to the surface to generate, or to a heat exchanger underground that will then generate the power. And one way to do that is to perforate the pipe in the geysers. We'll perforate the pipe where it's hot. The water in the field comes in and heats the pipe in pipe, and then it falls back down to the water into the reservoir, maintaining the reservoir so the water never comes out of it. But as you say, it's a matter of how do you ensure that you've got enough heat around the pipe and so that the fluid will flow back up without pumping. And if you need to pump, well, that's parasitic energy that needs to be built in.
So you're describing a system that is always on. In other words, it's not intermittent. It's base load energy because the Earth's hot all the time. And it is not a big footprint. It's basically a wellhead or a group of wellheads, which of course we already have oil and gas fields that have wellheads. They're not that big. And it's inexhaustible. It doesn't run out. And it's widely distributed around the Earth, not maybe everywhere. Everywhere, if you go deep enough, it gets hot, but some places you don't have to go very deep and it gets hot quicker. So is that a summary?
That's very good, Richard. And anyway, the answer is yes, it's everywhere. And so the holy grail would be geothermal everywhere. And not just for power generation, but for heating. And right now, Europe is building lots of wells to try and they've already done greenhouse heating, but now they're thinking, well, maybe this is a way to do our district heating systems. In Germany, the wind is in the north of the country, and the big loads in Munich, et cetera, are in the south. And if they want to get rid of their nuclear plants, which I think would be foolish, they have to build a lot of geothermal. But
So
it
kind of
is
a neat
base
feature
load.
of this is that it uses technology from oil and gas and fossil fuels to drilling and the pipes and the pumps and so forth.
And
is,
that's why
Yeah, let's
Baker
explore
Hughes-
some of the oil and gas parallels. I think there's some really interesting stuff to talk about there.
Why aren't the oil and gas companies putting a lot of energy effort into this as they expect oil and gas to get phased out?
Well, they are starting to. Our primary lead investor is Baker Hughes, who was an oil and gas services company around the world. And they also had been in geothermal, so they decided to invest in us. Chevron, BP, and others are talking. Chevron has invested in Ever, which is the Canadian closed loop company. Chevron used to be very big in geothermal, particularly in Indonesia. And in fact, yes, they used to run the wells. Anyway, they've run a number of wells, but they got out of the geothermal business maybe 10 years ago, and now they're getting back in. So the oil companies are indeed aware, and they have a lot of staff who are interested, and the transfers will occur. Texas is coming out with a big report. A woman named Amy Beard is a very strong advocate of geothermal, but she's from Texas, and they're coming out with a big report within the next 2 weeks about geothermal in Texas, because there is geothermal energy in various places in Texas and offshore in the Gulf. So yes, oil and gas companies will be increasingly moving. The talk is that yes, they can come in and really make it all work. It won't be that easy. And certainly the retrofits of oil and gas wells depend on particular circumstances, but there are millions of those that have been abandoned. So what do? They haven't been plugged yet, and they cost $500,000 to plug. So anyway, oil and gas will be learning about geothermal if they haven't already.
Let's
on
answer
that-
Jeff Brewer's. Jeff Brewer asked a question in the chat. Let's get to that. Geothermal skeptics like to claim that closed loop systems can't keep extracting heat because the adjacent rock will eventually be cooled by the circulating fluid, and the thermal conductivity of the surrounding rock is too low to replace it. Is this a worry? And if so, can you beat it by drilling through a brine deposit?
Well, you think that might be a worry. But what we've done is we've had the national laboratories, Berkeley being the primary one, who've looked at how fast will the rock deplete. And it turns out that it might take, there's an initial depletion in the heat just when you start up a geothermal well. But the circumstances will enable geothermal wells to last 25 to 30 years before they deplete to a level that's insufficient. And then the national lab, Lawrence Berkeley lab, did several studies for us. And we also had Livermore do some work for us about connecting pipes at the bottom. So we think it will work. And
You're trying it.
Well, certainly at the geysers, there's circulation in that field. It's water that's circulating down in that field. It's a steam field. So for those fields, it's a matter of the water, but the northern part of the geysers does not come to the surface. So that's why we're testing our theories and our technologies actually in a existing well at the geysers. And if that's successful, they'll be able to expand into the areas that the steam doesn't come up to the surface, but it's still there in the reservoir.
So there are, economics is part of this, obviously, because it doesn't matter if it works, if it costs too much per watt. So question from Marvin, how much do we need to reduce drilling costs from current best practice to make closed loop systems viable, or I would say economic? And then are there other issues besides the drilling costs that are particularly expensive pieces of this?
Well, the drilling cost can be, 60 to 70% of the overall cost of a project. And that's actually one thing that our business plan at GreenFire Energy is concerned about. But what we're doing is working with existing fields where the flow of the fluids has either stopped or is not sufficient to support an economic well. But if the heat is still there, which it is in some cases in the Philippines, for example, you can extract the heat economically without any new drilling. And so the incremental costs of that are down around $30 a megawatt hour, or even lower, because you're not drilling and the infrastructure is already there. So, you know, you can really do very well. On the other hand, a greenfield project, yes, to be truly successful. But I look at this, you know, we send rockets, we send men to the moon, and we're sending rockets to Mars. We ought to be able to drill a well 10 miles down. The technology of it just needs to be perfected and developed, and a lot of learning by doing as you go deeper and hotter. And if there are companies that have developed new drilling techniques that send metal pellets, fire them like rockets to drill through rock, not the sedimentary rock, but the hard rock down below, miles down. GreenFire Energy, which is an MIT developed company, wants to use millimeter waves and fire them into the rock. And they think they can go 10 miles down and develop it. So yes, a key is the drilling costs and the drilling technologies. But I think we understand that. And again, it's the learning by doing. Wind turbines didn't go from 75 kilowatts to 15 megawatts overnight. We need to try this, and it's been significantly underfunded compared to all the other energy resources, whether you're talking about oil and gas, nuclear, natural gas, coal. They're all subsidized in many different ways from tax credits. The problem with geothermal is it has typically taken 5 to 7 years from the time you begin a project to the time you actually start selling the power. That's because the permitting takes so long. That's because getting all the pieces together, if we can reduce that time, which we should be able to, down to 4 years, then it'll work. And certainly with retrofits, we can do retrofits in 6 months to a year. And that's what we're aiming for. And again, like any business, it requires research, development, and demonstration. Only now is the government in the US becoming interested in funding geothermal to the level that it should. Some of that's or most of that now has gone to enhanced geothermal, which is basically fracking existing reservoirs to increase the fissures so that the fluid will flow and the brine will come up. That is only available in certain areas, whereas closed loop is much more scalable. And so
you've got two easy ways to cut the costs. Go where the heat is near the surface, so you don't have to drill very far, very deep, or use holes that are already in the ground that somebody else drilled.
That certainly in existing geothermal fields, there are dry wells or wells that have non-condensable liquids and other things that prevent them from being fully economic. And so if you can go in with closed loop and make that well economic, they're very happy to do that.
Well, I know that to drill an oil and gas well in most states, it takes maybe a few weeks or months to get a permit, certainly not years. So why is it so much longer for a geothermal project to drill a hole?
That is a good question. And like I say, the EPA is involved. If you're bringing brine to the surface, there are lots of critical minerals in there. And we'll talk about lithium because
every oil and gas well brings brine to the surface too.
Well, the geothermal lobbyists have not been good enough. California right now is revising its geothermal regulations for the first time in like 30 years. So we'll have a new set, which will help the permitting process. But the permitting is absolutely essential. The Bureau of Land Management manages portions of the country that would be very beneficial for geothermal, but they haven't yet got their act together to develop it. But I think now we have Jennifer Granholm is the new Secretary of Energy. She's very knowledgeable, very energetic, and she understands that learning can only take place by funding RD&D. I mean, as you may know, back when Jimmy Carter was president, we started spending money on energy. the budget for Department of Energy declined ever since the late 70s, early 80s, up until, you know, very recently. And now the new Infrastructure Act offers great promise for all technologies. And that's good news.
All right, there's a question from Steve. Quays, is that the company, proposes to reach 66,000 feet where the temperature is 500 degrees C and lithostatic pressure is 76,000 PSI. Will the hole creep shut?
Well, I don't know, but Quays probably doesn't think so. I mean, I don't know what there is. Obviously a lot of pressure down there, but there's also solid rock. So we'll see. In Iceland, they've drilled wells that actually went down to the magma by accident, but they've drilled deep wells and been able to cement them.
Can I interject something on the Quays question?
Sure.
Just to flesh that out. I think it can creep shut, and it leads to the question of, will they use a weighted completion brine like we would in a well? And if so, is the completion brine going to be the circulating fluid for the heat transfer? Does that mean we have to use all nickel alloy casings? When you get to engineering a plant that's going to work with Quays's proposed drilling, it's actually a significant engineering problem. And
Yes.
The reason for trying to build a reference or benchmark plant design is to put in place proposals for all of the elements of a plant so we can see where the engineering challenges are and really focus the effort on the ones that count.
Well, and that's absolutely correct. And the truth is you can't do everything. So there are groups like at the University of Texas that are, looking at how do we use artificial intelligence and how do we improve the existing drilling technologies so we can go deeper and they can be more reliable and don't have as many problems with drilling and wearing out drill bits, et cetera, making the completions more efficient and cost effective. It's not easy necessarily, but it is something that good engineers would certainly like to try and do and have succeeded in doing. So why not do it with geothermal energy, and which has got, as I said, many different advantages, and we want to make it affordable, obviously. But what's affordable? We use levelized cost of energy as a measure that's used throughout in measuring alternative energy sources. And so solar likes to say, well, we're $20 to $30 a megawatt hour, and geothermal's at $50 and $60 a megawatt hour. So they're more expensive, except that they're intermittent. So if you actually do an analysis, it costs them 5 times more. Or if you want to add batteries that are $150 a megawatt hour, geothermal is cheaper.
Always on is worth something.
And the grids require reliability. And as we've now found out from all the events that can cause a lack of reliability, I will mention one of my favorites in terms of solar. You may not have heard of Mount Tomba. You've heard of Mount Krakatoa. You've heard of the Philippines. When volcanoes like Mount Tomba go off, the sun doesn't shine around the world. There's global obscuring of the sun during the summers, and that's called the summer. The year without a summer. I think it was like 1815 or something like that. But if you're relying on a solar grid, and on a day that I mentioned in California when the sun also didn't shine because of wildfires and weather conditions. So relying on solar, geothermal is always there. It's got, as Richard mentioned, the smallest footprint on the ground, and the pipes are under the ground, so they're protected. Gee, that's why the US military is actually quite interested in geothermal, because it's the most secure, and why the international politicians are now interested in geothermal, because it basically is internationally energy secure. It does not require that you trade with someone, except perhaps for components that you don't manufacture. But everyone seems to manufacture steel pipes, and there are companies that you can buy them from, etc., and knows how to drill wells all around the world. That isn't true of trade in oil or trade in other products or trade in lithium.
Yeah.
or cobalt.
Gaurav asked about energy storage capabilities. Now, we just talked about how you don't need to store it if it's always available, or at least you need to transmit it, but you don't need to store it, for the off times because it's always on. So is there any storage implications otherwise?
Actually, there are people that have talked about storing excess heat in geothermal reservoirs. In other words, you could pump it down. And that's, I'm not that familiar with those proposals. There are good energy storage proposals now around using compressed air and concrete pipes. We haven't talked about hydrogen, and hydrogen is getting a lot of play by the oil and gas companies because it sounds like it's very, it's, if you burn it correctly, if you just burn hydrogen, you don't get carbon dioxide, you get water. And if you burn hydrogen, you unfortunately produce more NOx pollution by burning hydrogen than you do from natural gas. So nobody really mentions that. Hydrogen is being talked about as a storage vehicle for the Intermountain Power Plant, which is in Utah. And it was a big coal-fired power plant. It will be converted to natural gas. And then the idea is that there'll be hydrogen generated and stored in domes, salt domes, and then used to generate power. Well, part of the problem with hydrogen is the overall efficiency. When you create the hydrogen, you have to use energy. So it may be the round trip efficiency is like 70% or something. Well, can you use hydrogen fuel cells and other things in cars and trucks? Well, you have to have the infrastructure that does that. And at least in my looks at it, you might be able to create a useful hydrogen distribution system along major interstates for truckers to use. I don't see it displacing electric vehicles that you charge up at your home or residence or commercial buildings. So hydrogen has promise, but it has many different problems that relate to the efficiency of its conversions. They've now, for lobbying reasons, just like the wind and solar people have called themselves variable energy instead of intermittent, the hydrogen people now have colors for hydrogen so that you can feel comfortable with it. And, brown hydrogen, well, that's just created from maybe burning coal or the fossil fuels. But you now have blue hydrogen, which, if you generate hydrogen with electrolysis or natural gas processes, you use power to do that. But if you use green technologies like geothermal or solar or wind, because you can have interruptible hydrogen processing, then you can call it green. And isn't that wonderful? Well, it's green maybe, but what about the power that green energy would have used to purchase, to power residences or electricity grid? So you're displacing power, essentially. There isn't enough green energy to power everything that we'd like to power. So if it's powering a hydrogen plant, it may be saying it's green, but it's displacing power somewhere else. And if you put hydrogen into gas pipes, we can burn it in our houses, and we can mix it with natural gas. We've tried that anyway. Well, it turns out that if you do put it into a pipe that's designed for natural gas, it will embrittle the steel in the pipe. And so you have a limit on how much you can mix in, maybe 10%, 15%. So there's lots of issues with hydrogen. I know that Shell is going to be using Rotterdam they're building a plant, I think in the north of Holland, but in Netherlands, but they want to use Rotterdam as a major distribution system throughout Europe. Hydrogen, it sounds sexy, but it has many interesting facets to it. GreenFire actually has a technology where we can do hydrogen production more efficiently by using the heat that comes up as well as the power that you generate. But
I know you could use hydrogen and fill a dirigible and float over to Europe on it. How about that?
Yeah, well, they've talked about hydrogen-powered airplanes, but they forgot about the Hindenburg. So, it's
well,
what idea? What are you going to fuel planes with? It's
We're coming up to to the end of the hour. Is there anything that you particularly think that hasn't been discussed yet that's important to mention?
Well, I think, resilience is the buzzword for 2022, 2023. You have to think about, is the energy system resilient? Is the technology resilient under events that we haven't properly considered? And you have to have diversity in your energy systems. So all of these technologies can contribute in some way to that diversity. Security is now a critical word. Research, development, demonstration. As scientists, we all know that that's valuable and that it takes time to bring technologies to fruition and commercial viability. That's what we're trying to do at GreenFire Energy. We hope we're successful, but there are many different ideas out there, and we need to encourage young scientists to go into scientific fields instead of investment banking or something like that. So those are the things I'd like to leave you with: is support geothermal energy and support research and development, and think of the criteria that we need, which include security and resilience and environmental impacts and risks. So.
Now this group at SSP, alumni and friends, is particularly, I think, above average good at separating the science and engineering from the PR bullshit. So that's something that we all have to keep in mind. We've kind of touched on that this evening. There is a lot of PR BS out there. But speaking of SSP, Mirza asks about, how was your SSP experience, and how do you think directly or indirectly it influenced your decision to pursue a career in energy?
Well, if you're asking me, I'd say
Yeah,
it was a fascinating experience. Obviously, it was a 6-week program held at the Thatcher School in Ojai. And it was a time that I had previously decided, yes, I would like to be a scientist, because scientists have many good works that they can do. I think the Men of the Year Time magazine was 1960 for scientists. SST, the field trips, I saw the first laser at Ted Maimon's lab in Malibu. It was great, and I said, this is fantastic, and look what happened to lasers. And I decided to go into physics at Harvey Mudd, and then went on to graduate school at Berkeley, and then later on postdocs at the Rutherford Lab and at Harvard. All of those were my scientific background, which I think SSP was highly instrumental in encouraging me to pursue a scientific career. And so I've tried to use science as much as I can. I haven't really done research physics since the 1970s. So, but I find communications are absolutely critical, and being able to understand and communicate what science can do, what engineering can do, and what technologies are capable of is absolutely critical. And I think it got a great head start with summer science program.
well, many of us can agree to that. Any final questions from the audience? You can unmute yourself or type it in the chat. We have 3 minutes to go. I want to encourage everyone to look up GreenFire Energy's website. There are papers there that Andy wrote, and otherwise reference materials to get a good idea about what's going on in this further research. Jess, did you have a question? Or are you just waving?
It's waving. It's great to see some old friends here. I saw, but anyway, I saw several from 1962. Alan Gross, I can remember.
Alan?
We drove up in my 55 Chevy. We drove up to Ojai together, and our parents probably said, "Oh my God, we're going to let our 2 boys drive, 16-year-olds or wherever we were, drive to Ojai." But we did. We survived 6 weeks with George Abel and the lady and the nurse there. But it's great to see some old friends here, and I think it's fun to have had a career that had so many interesting facets to it, and I'm sure all of you have had similar experiences after SSP.
Well, thank you for a very interesting hour. I think we all wish you and GreenFire and geothermal energy well. It sounds like a very promising a way to get energy out of, we're taught to think of the earth as a heat sink, right? It means it's not going to change temperature when you do something to it. It's not going to cool off very much when we pull all the heat that we can out of it. It's not going to matter. So that is very promising. And thank you for talking about it with us. And for that, we'll adjourn for the evening.
It's my pleasure. And thank you and good to see all of you.